Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. I'm Matt Holiner, covering weather for Lee's Midwest news sites and apps from Chicago. But of course, it's not just me. I'm joined by my fellow meteorologist, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and Sean Sublette in Richmond, Virginia. The fourth member of our team, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, Oklahoma, still out on maternity leave, but she'll be back in just a couple of weeks, and we're definitely looking forward to it. Now, for this week's episode, it's something that if you haven't experienced yourself, I'm sure you've heard about it. The Canadian wildfires and all the smoke associated with them. Now, we've been dealing with this story for weeks, but the worst was on Wednesday, June 7th, when the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic were absolutely covered in smoke, and New York City recorded its worst air quality ever. Now, Joe, you were awfully close in New Jersey, and I know you were impacted as well. So for those of us that weren't there, can you describe what that was like?
Well, I'll tell you what my wife said, because she works in New York City. It looked like Mars out there in New York. It was orange everywhere, smelled like you wanted to roast a marshmallow. That's what she said. Even down by, our office, closer to Atlantic City, it looked like a cloudy day out. I mean, it like with no sun whatsoever. It looked just like a dark and dreary day out there. And you could still smell the wildfire smoke as well. And if you smell the wildfire smoke, it's kind of already too late. Those particles that aren't good for you to breathe in are already getting into your system if you can smell the wildfire smoke. So in New York City, in the northern, we'll say North Jersey, we won't get into the central North-South Jersey debate, but it was definitely a once-in-a-generation type of experience.
Yeah, we certainly hope once in a generation because, man, I just saw the pictures, and those pictures were just incredible. I mean, the images that were coming out, and I think that's why it just becomes such a national story, because you just never had seen these things over New York City, these orange skies. And you're right. I mean, that's what I assumed, because the pictures I saw, it really looked like Mars. It's like, whoa, we've seen pictures like this from California before and Colorado, but up in the Northeast, like to see these images, it was pretty incredible. So I can imagine it was quite the experience.
Yeah, definitely quite the experience. And we get into this in the show, but it's really been about 5-6 weeks of at least wildfire smoke in the sky. Might not be smelling it every day, but it's just been persistent here across the area.
Yeah, and, we just wanted to dive into all of this deeper. So, why are Canada's wildfires so bad this year? Why has so much of the smoke ended up over the U.S.? What are the short-term and long-term impacts from this smoke exposure? And, we found the perfect guest for this episode to help us answer all our questions. Dr. Emily Fisher from Colorado State University. She's an atmospheric chemist who studies wildfire smoke. And she's even flown over wildfires to collect samples of the smoke. So it was a great conversation, and one we'll bring you right after this break. Welcome back, everyone, to the Across the Sky podcast. Our guest this week is Dr. Emily Fisher, an associate professor in the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University. Her research focuses on how climate change is affecting wildfires and the impact of wildfire smoke on people. She's also a member of Science Moms, an organization of climate scientists and mothers who are helping other moms better understand climate change. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of British Columbia, master's degree from the University of New Hampshire, PhD from the University of Washington, and we are thrilled to have her on the show. Dr. Fisher, welcome to Across the Sky.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
And so as we do with all our guests, I'd like to start by asking you, what got you interested in weather? What made you want to start studying the atmosphere, and specifically how it interacts with wildfires?
I have been interested in the weather from the time I was a child. I was 10 when Hurricane Bob came through Rhode Island. I'm originally from the East Coast, though I live in Colorado now. And I was fascinated, impressed, amazed at the ability to predict something like that and to prepare for that level of a natural disaster. And I was a kid who, I called my local weatherman, who was John Giorsi, and I feel like I should reach out to John Giorsi and tell him, look, it turned out I got a PhD in atmospheric science. But he called me back. He was on air when I called, right? And I asked him what made wind. So I've just been fascinated in the atmosphere, and I care deeply about air quality. And I think we all have issues that we care about, and we don't always control what things we care about. Some of us are interested, right, in healthcare, access to healthcare, and some of us are interested in environmental issues, and some of us are interested in animals. And I just happen to care about air quality. And so as soon as I figured out that that was a thing that I could study, as I started as an undergraduate, I never looked back. So, and then if you spend any time living in the Western US, fires are a thing. And I like to work on projects that have a global relevance, but a local component. And I think that really helps me understand them more deeply. So I experience the phenomenon. I have sort of this local understanding of how it's impacting people, and it's sort of connected to a broader picture. So fires fall in that category, and some of the other things that I work on also fall in that category. They span this local to national to international space. But, if you live in the West anywhere, you're going to interact with fires and smoke, and it's a thing that will draw your attention.
Yeah, and I know most of your research on wildfires has been focused in the United States, but of course this time they're occurring in Canada and having impacts here in the U.S. So, what can you tell us about why the fires in Canada this year have been so much worse than in previous years?
So this year, it comes down to aridity or dryness. And so it has just been very dry. Wildfires are very responsive to environmental conditions. And so just imagine tossing a match into a dry brown field versus tossing that match into a well-watered lawn, right? Or a snow-covered area. And so if you have a very dry conditions, that's exactly what will lead to the chance of wildfires. And then it's just a matter of whether you have an ignition source.
Emily, it's Joe here. So I am in New Jersey.
Yes.
And a couple of Wednesdays ago, we had New Jersey turn into Mars for some reason or another. It was orange everywhere, at least in the northern half of the state, with the wildfire smoke. New York City, you saw the worst air quality in the world. Where I am in South Jersey, it wasn't quite orange, but it was very, very hazy. And it has been really since the middle of May, both with Alberta wildfires and then what's happening in Quebec, in Ontario, and Nova Scotia here. I guess at a 360 view, what actually caused the smoke to reach these unprecedented levels, in the Northeast? Because it's not like we haven't seen wildfire smoke before, at least here in the Northeast.
There's a few issues. And one is the fires that are occurring are large. And they're so large, some of them, that they're creating their own weather, right? These are big wildfires. And fires that are that large, they create very, very dense amounts of smoke, so much so that when you fly through them, and maybe we'll talk about this earlier, you can't see anything, right? It's 10 times as dense as what you're have experienced in New Jersey. There's been just very efficient transport of the smoke to these populated areas in the Northeast. And it's new for the Northeast, but it's not new for the Western cities. So San Francisco, Seattle have been experiencing these kinds of smoke-filled conditions quite frequently over the last couple of years. And it's just a matter of when the wildfire is extremely active, the winds just happen to push that smoke in a certain direction at that level of the atmosphere. And so the faster and more efficient and more narrow that smoke plume is, the more concentrated it's going to be when it gets to its receptor region, which, was your neighborhood this time. So that's as simple as it is. And the smoke from wildfires is injecting in various levels of the atmosphere throughout the day. In the early morning and, overnight, it's injecting lower in the atmosphere. As it grows throughout the day, it tends to inject higher. But if you have conditions where that smoke, mixes back down into the lower atmosphere, you can get, really concentrated plumes moving very efficiently at all levels of the atmosphere, actually. So yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry. I have family in New Jersey too, so I feel your pain.
Well, apology accepted, so it's no problem there. But yeah, it was definitely a generational, at least, type event for us here. I wanted to ask one brief follow-up, Sean. I know you're going to ask, but I just wanted to, ask in May. So we did have the wildfire smoke in May, but it wasn't as hazy. And then, early June came and it became a lot thicker. Would you be able to just talk about the differences between what we saw in May as opposed to what we, the more notable worldwide event that happened in early June?
When it's more concentrated, you're receiving smoke that's fresher, more dense, and you're getting it a more direct transport pathway. And I think, because I wasn't there during that more recent event, you were even able to smell the smoke, right?
Yeah, you are.
Had a scent, right? Yeah. And then a few months, maybe it's just a few weeks ago, month and a half ago, the prior smoke event, right? You couldn't smell it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So the compounds in smoke that you can smell, they have a lifetime of about a day. So when you can smell the smoke, it's often more concentrated and fresher. And when you can't smell the smoke, but you see that haze, it usually just means it's been processed in the atmosphere for over a day. So it's taken longer than a day to get to you. And if something is taking longer to get to you, there's also more opportunities for dilution, for deposition, for the things that are in smoke to come out. And so that's really the difference between those two events is the distance and a sort of duration of time that passed between the fire and the smoke coming to your neighborhood.
Yeah, and to follow up about the transport of that particulate matter, as Joe knows, and most of us in the weather field know, the upper level winds or the steering winds were kind of unusual for this time of the year anyway, which is part of the reason the smoke got this far south. Even here where I was in Virginia, we had a fair bit, not as thick as in the Northeast, but we got some here. And as you mentioned, this is something that is much more common in the Western United States. Can I get you also to speak a little bit more about how this does fold back in to the warming climate? Oftentimes I hear that, well, somebody started a fire, but I try to remind people, and you jump in if I'm a little off base here, that the origin of the fire isn't the important thing. I mean, it's not that it's not important, but the conditions of the land that surround it will really govern how fast it spreads and how far it spreads. So can I get you to riff on that just a little bit? Is that kind of the right idea?
Yeah, Sean, you're totally right. And in fact, my group has worked on this, and I can talk a little bit about that. So not with Canadian fires, but with wildfires in the Western U.S. and in the Southeastern United States is where we've specifically focused on this link. And other people have worked in Canada. And so in general, you can look back at our fire records over the last 30, 40 years, and that interannual variability in burn area is linked to environmental conditions. And which environmental condition is most important depends on the ecosystem. So in some places, it is the precipitation that is the best explainer that we have of that year's burn area. And other places, it is the aridity that best explains. In the Rocky Mountains where I live, that interannual variability in burn area is really very tightly linked to our aridity. And so we have also looked at this as a function of ignition source. And human-started fires and lightning-started fires, both their year-to-year burn area that they produce, the sort of severity and extent of the fires that are started by both of those ignition sources, lightning or human ignition sources, they vary with environmental conditions. So you are absolutely right. It's not the ignition source, right? We are priming the environment for conditions that will facilitate large fires. And so as we look forward with climate change, and I mean, climate change is happening right now also, but one thing we know very well is that temperatures will continue to rise. And the second thing that we know very well over North America is that in general, it will be drier. And so just that alone will facilitate more periods of time where large fires could occur. And yes, so it's interesting, in the West, there's been a lot of work, right, to educate people about fire safety and to be careful with ignition sources, particularly in certain times of year. And probably more work needs to happen in, other parts of the world where typically we haven't been so vulnerable to fires.
Yeah, it's not what we want to hear when you talk about climate change and how we could be seeing more of these types of events. And what I want to dive into now is some of your research, because it sounds really cool. I know some of it has involved actually flying over wildfires to sample the smoke. So can you tell us about this and what is actually smoke made out of? That's kind of a key question. What are the components that are actually in wildfire smoke?
Sure. So in 2018, I led what was at that time one of the largest field missions in atmospheric chemistry to study wildfires. And we worked with the National Science Foundation National Center for Atmospheric Research, C-130 research aircraft. And so we filled that research aircraft with so many different instruments. It was like a flying chemistry lab. And we took that facility and we visited more than 20 different very large wildfires. And if you remember, 2018 was a very active wildfire year. So we're talking about like the Carr Fire, the Mendocino Complex, some of these really, really big wildfires. And so what we would do was go behind the wildfire or upwind of the fire, kind of see what was happening, figure out the background atmosphere that the smoke was, that the fire was injecting the smoke into. And then we would come around downwind of the fire, and we would, as soon as it was safe, so outside of the updraft, these are large fires, they're making very large updrafts, we would turn the plane directly into the smoke, directly into the outflow. And then we would go out the other side, and it's like many minutes pass. It's a little unnerving. It smells like you can't see anything. It's very red. It's very eerie. As a parent of small children, I was like, what am I doing right now? Why am I doing this? And then you come out the other side, get a sample of the air on the other side and go right back in. And we mowed the lawn or shoveled the snow. I guess this is the time of year where you'd mow the lawn. We mowed the lawn through the smoke plume. And we did that again and again and again to understand how the smoke changes in that very, very close to the fire in that first couple hours, and really understand what's happening and what's in the smoke. So what's in smoke? It is a very complex mixture of gases and particulates. And so the fine particulates are very different than a typical urban air pollution mixture. They are generally what we call organic carbon. So these are chemical compounds with carbon-carbon bonds. We don't have perfect characterization of chemically of exactly all of that, but most of the aerosol is organic carbon. And then you have a lot of carbon-containing gases. So there's lots of carbon monoxide, for example, anytime you have incomplete combustion. So there's a lot of carbon monoxide, there's a lot of carbon dioxide. There are a lot of what we would think of as hazardous air pollutants. So things like formaldehyde, benzene, these are all organic compounds that you don't really want to be breathing. Those are in there. There's also quite a few nitrogen-containing compounds. There's nitrogen in the wood and in the material that's being burnt. And so that's what my team studies. So that's what smoke is made out of. And it every single one of those compounds, every single one of those chemicals, they all interact differently with sunlight and with water. So they have different solubility, they have different deposition rates, they have different what we call photolysis rates, or how quickly they're broken down by sunlight. They react differently with other compounds in the smoke. And so it's a very interesting mixture. It's very chemically active, particularly in the first couple hours. And then some of the chemistry slows down with time it's ever evolving because it's going from concentrated to dilute And that will change the composition a little bit too, because it changes the chemistry. Does that help?
Yes, and I figured it was going to be a little bit more complex than we think. I know there are a lot of different elements that make up smoke, but also when you were describing flying through the smoke, it reminded me a lot of some of the hurricane hunters that we've had on this podcast. It sounded very similar, going back and forth through the hurricane, back and forth through the wildfire smoke, and honestly, I think kind of just as scary as well. That would be a pretty nerve-wracking experience. I'm not sure I'd be up for that, actually.
I mean, these are wonderful pilots. It's very safe activity, I would say. It feels like you shouldn't be doing it. And, we're very careful not to interfere with the firefighting teams. And the firefighting teams aren't trying to fly in the smoke where you can't see anything. So it's, there's lots of aircraft around wildfires. And the key thing for us was to stay out of the way of the firefighters. But, you operate in very safe conditions. You're, remain 2,000 feet above the ground and because you can't see anything. So you don't want to run into Mount St. Helens, for example. So, but it was unnerving for me, but I don't think the pilots were nervous. The other thing that we did on that field program, which was really difficult, but so fascinating, was try to sample smoke cloud mixtures. So in those cases, we would be looking for these, I know this is a weather podcast, so I'll just get into a tiny bit of detail here. There were these beautiful cumulus fields, right? And we would go sample the smoke under them and then move up into these little puffy clouds and try to collect the cloud droplets. So we were taking the plane and going zooming cloud to cloud. And, I was in the cockpit, so not getting as sick as I would have gotten. I always medicate on these planes, but the back of the plane was definitely getting sick. But it was kind of amazing to, try to capture the cloud particles that were impacted by smoke.
Yeah, just one other thing that you can do while you're up there in the smoke, take advantage of it and sample the clouds as well. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, but coming up, we're going to chat more about wildfires, smoke, and the impacts of climate change is having on them. So don't go anywhere. More Across the Sky in just a bit.
Blue Ridge Hospice thrift shops are bigger and better than ever, with a new and expanded site at one of our 2 Winchester locations and our 6 well-established boutiques across the area. Blue Ridge Hospice thrift shops attract bargain hunters, treasure seekers, collectors, and antiquers. Mention this ad on your next shopping trip and receive a 10% discount. Blue Ridge Hospice thrift shops gratefully accept your donations, including electronics and furniture. For locations, hours, and information on how to donate, please visit blueridgehospice.org.
Welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast, everyone. We release new episodes every Monday on all our lead news sites and apps, but also on all podcast platforms. And we even have a new YouTube channel. So really, wherever you like to get your podcasts, you can find us there. We're back with Dr. Emily Fisher from Colorado State University chatting about wildfires and smoke. And Emily, one of the things that came up in my research for this episode is that you and your family actually had to flee from the Cameron Peak fire while backpacking in 2020. Now, that sounds pretty scary. So can you describe that experience?
So 2020, right, the pandemic summer, we were looking for things to do with the kids. We had taken them to Rocky Mountain National Park a few weeks prior and had this great backpacking experience. So we, kind of at the last minute said, let's go up near Cameron Peak because that's just a little bit to the north of where I live. And so we camped out one night, and the next morning we got up and my kids were very whiny and we didn't make it that far. So we had, we stopped a little early for lunch and I said, okay, we can just sit and paint or do something if you guys don't feel like walking very far. And so we sat down by a tree to have lunch, and I came, stood up after lunch, and there was a big bubble on the backside of Cameron Peak. And I just looked at my husband. I was like, that's not a cloud. Like that's not a cloud. And I know that because in 2018, I had been flying all over the place looking at many wildfires. And I was like, we have to go now. And so we had to make a very quick decision of whether we were going uphill, which would have meant we would have to cross like 10, 11,000 feet with the kids, or to go back down the way we came. And so we just grabbed our children's hands and we ran out. And my daughter, who's 8 now, was 5 at the time. And she ran 6.5 miles in about 2.5 hours. And it was this, thankfully, the smoke was running parallel to us. So we could see the massive plume, and I didn't know what was going to happen, right? I mean, but we did make it out. But there was no, we were about between 1 and 2 miles from the start of the fire. And when we got out, the rangers, the fire didn't have a name, right? So I finally get out. We get out. I turn the key of the car over to make sure everything's going to be okay. Kids in the car, I tell them, you can start crying now. You can do whatever you need to do now. Because it had been, a few hours of here's a lifesaver. You get 1 sip of water, watch your ankles, no talking, right? Just running out. And this is quite rugged terrain where this is, and that you could tell because it was very hard to fight this fire. And so we got out, and I was like, what's the name of the fire? And the fire had no name. And actually the pictures that my husband took were used by the Forest Service in some of their investigative work about the cause of the fire. And so the Cameron Peak fire turned into, at that time, Colorado's largest fire. And it just, I watched that, every incident management report, every single night for that. And it burned, right through in October, and it basically burned until it snowed. And so it started in August, and it just continued on. And that smoke was sort of covering Fort Collins, and it was just very smoky here. There was ash falling on us all the time. And it was 2020, so you could really only be with people outside. So we were sitting, in the backyard with my brother, just ash falling on us. And it's what the world? This is so dark. And so that summer, my kids are quite traumatized. It's very hard to get them out hiking now. Unless it's actively raining. And so actually I'm going to come to the East Coast this summer, and I'm excited to take them a little bit to the New Hampshire mountains and sort of introduce them to hiking again in a non-Western way where the sort of threats are smaller. But I also that summer lived my graphs, right? So I had a student at the time who I actually had coffee with this morning, Steve Bry, and he had been working on the link between climate and wildfires. And summer 2020 was incredibly dry, and it was not surprising that from August to September, we had an extreme fire season here. And so I felt like I was living in those graphs. I felt like I understood those calculations in a much deeper way. And I would, honestly cry some days that summer because I was like, this is what climate change feels like. This is what this feels like. And at the same time, there was some really great work happening to try to understand the return cycle for events like that. And that may be 6 to 8 years. And that's a horrible type summer to have every 6 years. So I feel like that experience, it helped me understand fires and their impacts in a new way, in a very non-academic way. And it also kind of taught me and inspired some of my more recent work to think about how we communicate about wildfires so that people can protect themselves and their loved ones and their sort of vulnerable members of their family when smoke comes to town. So yeah, that's what that experience was like. Not great. I'm happy everybody was okay. It's certainly possible that we wouldn't have been had the winds been different.
Yeah, that is absolutely harrowing. And so congratulations on getting out with the kids and that they were all right. My kids are 24 and 20 now, so that's no longer an issue. But back to communication, and you talking about coming back here to the East Coast to do some hiking. Is there a way, or have you found any kind of good way to communicate what that risk is like in the Western United States for people who have not been there? Obviously, we had this big plume of smoke in the Northeast a few weeks ago. Would you say this is what we deal with all the time? Or would you say this is something that we're accustomed to all the time? How do you kind of convey the risk and what you contend with there in the Western United States versus someplace that is, in the East that has a more humid climate and tends to be more forested in the first place?
Well, there's a few things to think about with respect to this general question. The first one is, while I do not want to diminish the risk of these fires, and my family has run from a wildfire, and there's an incredibly sad loss of life and property associated with wildfires, so I do not want to diminish that. But more people are impacted by the wildfire smoke. And the health impacts are driven by the smoke, because just the sheer number of people that are impacted by smoke is much larger. And so as you think about preparing for wildfires, that preparation really needs to happen across the US with respect to the wildfire smoke, because the fire seasons are bad fire seasons or very severe fire seasons. The frequency of them is going to increase, unfortunately. And that's due to climate change and a legacy of land management decisions. And so we have to invest in our forests and work on preventing further climate change in order to address that. So we have to prepare for more smoke. And so preparing for more smoke will look different depending on your work and your home and your lifestyle, and whether you have someone in that is, you yourself are sort of a member of a vulnerable group or not. So vulnerable groups are people with pre-existing respiratory and cardiovascular issues, and or the very young or the elderly. And so in my family, I have an older house, but I have a portable AC unit that I'm ready if the smoke comes, so that I can close the windows and have it not be blazing hot. And I have a number of air filters that are ready to go. And I don't need them all the time, but I have a sort of kit, the wildfire smoke is coming kit. And I would encourage families to do that. And in fact, my mom in Rhode Island, she was hit by smoke, and she's funny. She's like, I have the windows open. I was like, no, you don't. Close those up, and I'm going to ship you some air filters, and this is how you're going to make yourself a clean airspace in case those winds shift that plume a little bit further north, because at the time it was just a little bit in southern Rhode Island and was more to the south. So I think sort of working with people so that they know what to do and how to protect themselves, and whether they need to protect themselves is what we actually need to do, because the smoke is not going anywhere. It's coming more and more.
Emily, changing gears a little bit here, you want to tell us a little bit about more of the work you do with Science Moms here, and where people could find more information about it?
Sure. Science Moms is a group of scientists who are also mothers. All of us work on something tied to climate change. So for me, that's what my work on wildfires, which are very tightly linked to climate change. And so what we're aiming to do is in a nonpartisan, we're not politicians, right? Many of us are academics, nonpartisan way, explain the fundamentals of climate change and help mothers understand what this issue means for their families, for their children, and also to give them confidence to speak out about the issues. So you don't have to understand every little bit about climate science in order to understand that this is, one of the most important issues of our time, and we absolutely have to take action now. We have about 10 years to do what needs to be done to slow this thing down. So that's what Science Moms is, and we're trying to offer information on fires, on drought, on all the way to what do I do in my own home to decarbonize it. We're offering, all of that in one sort of space for mothers. And so you can find out about that at sciencemoms.com. And there's videos of me and my colleagues, trying to explain things and trying to offer helpful advice. And we, showcase some of technologies too, and show how we use them. For me, I'm a big fan of the e-bike that reduces my transportation and carbon use substantially. So kind of show that and how we might go about that. So I even have done some videos on how do you call somebody that represents you, and what are the things that you can say if you are concerned about climate change and its impact on your kids. And so those are the kinds of things that we're doing in an educational sense.
Yeah, I really like the stuff that comes out of Science Moms. Y'all do great work, and as we wrap up here, I'm sure being involved with Science Moms, but also your research, people come to you, and are trying to understand it a little bit better. So when somebody comes to you and they're worried about the future and climate change and the impact it's going to have on wildfires, what do you tell them, to try and relax them? Because it is a stressful thing when we talk about climate change, because there's so much negativity around it, and we think about all of the bad things that can happen. But what's kind of a silver lining that you see to trying to help relax people and focus on solutions and what we can do to help mitigate the risk. If we're going to see increased wildfires, well, what kind of stuff can we do to handle that situation? What is your response to somebody who's feeling a little uneasy? How can you hopefully make people feel a little bit more relaxed?
Yeah, I think it helps to just work on the issue. So, and there's a very tangible, you feel better once you start working on something. That applies to everything, right? Sometimes starting the job is the hardest piece of doing something, right? So, I'm telling them to do what they can do. So that might be share information about climate change, swap things in their home, and speak up to people that represent them. And then I am also telling them that there is hope, right? So we caused this problem. We understand what the solutions are, and we have the technical capacity to change the way we produce and use energy. And so we just need the will to do that. And so I think things could be much worse if we didn't know how to solve the problem, right? But we actually know how to solve the problem. We just have to decide. And so I encourage people to put that pressure on people that represent them at all levels of government, because that is one of the most important things that you can do. And it's very, very important. And it's something that anyone can do. So yes, it's the only thing, I would say, if you have children, be careful about how you talk about climate change to children. With my own kids, I tell them, this isn't a weight that you have to carry right now. This is an adult problem, and I'm working on it. And that helps to reduce the anxiety in my house, that I'm not ignoring it, right? I'm not pretending it's not an issue. These are the ways that I'm working on this issue. So those are my little pieces of advice I would give you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and focus on the solutions rather than, I think it's easy to focus on all the negativity and then focus on the worry about all the bad, but like, there are things we can do, and focusing on what can we do that actually can turn that anxiety a little bit into positive outcome and maybe actually lead to a solution to this big problem. Well, Emily, this has been a great conversation, but where can people find out more about your research and Science Moms?
So I'm in the atmospheric science department at Colorado State University. I'm the only Emily professor there, so it's easy to find me there. And you can find out more about Science Moms at sciencemoms.com, and that'll link you to videos and Instagram and all the ways that you can follow that.
Awesome. I'm sure people will definitely be checking that out. Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining the podcast, and hopefully we can have you back on again soon.
I would love to. This has been really fun.
Great. Well, we're going to take one more quick break, but we're going to be back with some closing thoughts in just a second, so stay tuned. More Across the Sky coming up.
Now is the time for America to chart its course to a green energy future. And we can't do it without clean hydrogen. But it's up to regulators in Washington to establish the right rules that advance clean hydrogen today. Clean hydrogen needs the full extent of the production tax credit to decarbonize heavy industry, create high-skilled jobs, and lead the global energy transition. Get the facts at cleanhydrogentoday.org. Paid for by the Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Energy Association.
And we're back on Across the Sky, and I can definitely say I have a better understanding of how wildfires and wildfire smoke work after that conversation. Guys, what about you?
Yeah, for me, just to hear that harrowing tale of her having to pick up the kids and literally run for hours to get out of the way of this thing in northern Colorado really puts it all into perspective. And the important thing here to remember, and I think sometimes we forget, we focus on the fires themselves so often and the flames, but it's the smoke, which I think so many of us saw, of course, a couple of weeks ago, that is far more pervasive and does more long-term damage and affects more people in terms of health impacts. I think that's the other thing we need to be cognizant of, even if we don't live in an area that is especially close to fires in and of themselves.
And I just, keep going back to her story that she had in Colorado when she was backpacking through there with her kids. I mean, you have kids, her husband running, away from the fire. And like she said, it was the biggest fire in Colorado's history. I mean, that's something that lives with you for a while. And she definitely made mention of that.
Yeah, that was, really a great story. And just the kind of takeaway for me is that, after we dealt with what we saw over the Northeast. But again, we've been dealing with it in the Midwest as well. Just all the talk, it just seems like, never at this level. We're talking about so many days with the hazy skies and the reduced air quality. But, unfortunately, it looks like that's where we're headed. These things are becoming more common, whether it's in the West or up in Canada. Is the conditions for wildfires, because the weather is getting more extreme, the conditions that cause wildfires getting extreme, these things are becoming more common. So this is just one more thing we have to add to the list of things that we need to be prepared for and things we need to be working on solutions for, which actually ties back into last week's episode. We really want to thank you, our listeners, for checking out last week's episode, which was all about climate change solutions with Project Drawdown and Dr. Kate Marvel. And we actually did get some listener feedback on that episode, including an email from Steve, who wrote, "More electric cars, high-speed trains, and nuclear energy, as well as sealing methane sources, will cut most of the greenhouse gas emissions. All this needs to be done ASAP. We cannot wait for everyone to get on board. Tomorrow is not soon enough." And Steve, I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you for the email. And if you have a comment about the show or have a weather question you'd like us to answer, send us an email at podcasts@lee.net. podcasts@lee.net. Or if you'd like to hear your voice on the podcast, leave us a voicemail by calling 609-272-7099. 609-272-7099. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, before we wrap up, it is almost here. Perhaps the most anticipated episode of the Cross the Sky yet, the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest. And I can't believe I just said that. So, Joe, you've been hyping this one for weeks, so I'm going to give you one more chance here. Why do people need to tune in?
If you love hot dogs, if you love New York City, if you love America, you'll love this episode.
I love you, Joe Martucci. God bless you, brother.
It's going to be great. George is great. Tremendous guest. If you see him up there on stage, he's all energy. He was much more, what should we say? Preparing, definitely a little more subdued, which was a good thing. Not a bad thing, a good thing. As we go into the hot dog eating contest, he's definitely saving up his energy for the 4th. So, check it out.
I think Sean is going to be absent from that episode.
That's what I heard.
I might take that one off.
You like hot dogs, Sean?
I do, but I prefer bratwurst because I can enjoy it a little bit longer. No offense to Nathan, he makes a great hot dog and all, but I prefer the Johnsonville stuff, which I think is made up by you there, Matt.
The Johnsonville brats. The Johnsonville brats, very good. They are very tasty. Well, maybe if it was a brat eating contest. We talked about, I think it was an egg eating contest. There are other eating contests that are going to discuss in this episode. So
oh my God.
It's going to be an experience. I hope you tune in. This will be certainly our most unique episode of Across the Sky yet. But for now, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Across the Sky. If you like the show, please give us a rating or post a review on your favorite podcasting platform. It helps us out. And of course, we appreciate the love. For Lee Enterprises and my fellow meteorologist, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, and Sean Sublette in Richmond, I'm Matt Holiner in Chicago. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll catch you again real soon.